Imagine a world where the sky remained an impenetrable barrier, where humanity looked up with longing but never conquered the clouds. Picture a reality where international travel took weeks instead of hours, where global commerce moved at the pace of ships and trains, where the very concept of aerial warfare never materialized, and where the entire trajectory of the 20th century followed a completely different path. This isn't science fiction. This is the world we would inhabit if Alberto Santos Dumont, the Brazilian aviation pioneer, had never built his flying machines and demonstrated controlled, powered flight before crowds of witnesses in Paris on that historic day in 1906. Today we're going to explore a timeline that never was, a reality that could have been, and understand just how profoundly one man's obsession with flight changed absolutely everything about the world we live in today. Before we dive into this incredible journey through history, I need your help with something important. Can we hit 100 comments on this video? I want to know what you think about this story, and honestly, your engagement helps us bring more fascinating documentaries like this one to life. So please, subscribe to the channel, watch until the very end, and drop a comment below. YouTube's algorithm rewards channels whose viewers stay engaged and watch completely, which means you'll be the first to see our next documentary if you do this. We need your support to keep creating these inspiring stories. Now, let's begin. The year is 1906, and in the fields of Bagatelle in Paris, something extraordinary is about to not happen. Santos Dumont does not climb into his 14 Biers aircraft. The crowd that gathered does not witness history. The Aero Club of France does not certify the first powered flight in Europe. And the domino effect of this absence begins to ripple through time like a stone never thrown into a pond, creating waves of non-existence that fundamentally alter human civilization. To understand what we lost, we must first understand what we had, and then systematically dismantle it, piece by piece, innovation by innovation, until we see the skeleton of an alternate world emerge from the fog of possibility. Santos Dumont was not just an inventor, he was a dreamer who made dreams tangible, a man who saw the sky not as a limit, but as a frontier waiting to be claimed. Born in Brazil in 1873, he moved to Paris as a young man, where he became fascinated with the idea of human flight. Before his heavier-than-air aircraft, he experimented extensively with dirigibles, those magnificent lighter-than-air ships that captured the imagination of the Belle Époque. His airships circled the Eiffel Tower, landed on Parisian streets, and proved that controlled aerial navigation was possible. But it was his work with airplanes, his determination to create a machine that could take off under its own power, fly a predetermined course, and land safely that changed everything. His 14 Bis was not the most elegant aircraft ever built, but it worked, it flew. And in flying, it opened a door that humanity walked through and never looked back. Now let's close that door and see what happens. In our alternate timeline, Santos Dumont turns his attention elsewhere. Perhaps he continues with dirigibles, or maybe a personal tragedy or financial setback diverts his path. The specific reason doesn't matter. What matters is that the 14 Bis never flies, and Europe never witnesses that crucial demonstration of powered, heavier-than-air flight in 1906. The Wright brothers' flights in North Carolina in 1903 remain obscure, unverified by international observers, and largely dismissed by the European scientific community as American exaggeration. Without Santos Dumont's public demonstrations and his generous sharing of technical knowledge, European aviation development stalls for years, perhaps decades. The immediate effect is subtle, but significant. Aviation development doesn't stop entirely, but it slows to a crawl. Without the proof of concept that Santos Dumont provided, without his inspiration and technical contributions, the race to develop practical aircraft loses momentum. Other pioneers continue their work, But without the foundation Santos Dumont laid, they face obstacles that take much longer to overcome. The technology that would have emerged by 1910 doesn't appear until 1920. The aircraft that would have existed in 1920 don't materialize until 1935. We're operating on a 15 to 20-year delay in aviation technology, and that delay has consequences that cascade through every aspect of human civilization. Let's start with World War I, that catastrophic conflict that reshaped the global order. In our reality, aircraft played an increasingly important role as the war progressed. Early reconnaissance planes spotted troop movements and artillery positions. Fighter aircraft emerged to contest control of the skies. Bombers appeared to strike behind enemy lines. The air war drove rapid innovation, transforming fragile wood and fabric contraptions into sophisticated weapons platforms in just 4 years. But in our alternate timeline, where Santos Dumont never accelerated aviation development, the Great War is fought almost entirely on the ground and sea. There are no dramatic dogfights over the Western Front. There are no bombing raids on London. Reconnaissance remains largely the domain of cavalry and observation balloons. The war is slower, more grinding, and possibly even more brutal, because the stalemate of trench warfare cannot be broken by air power. The tactical flexibility that aircraft provided simply doesn't exist, which means that the strategies and outcomes of major battles change in unpredictable ways. Perhaps the war lasts longer. Perhaps it ends differently. Perhaps the Treaty of Versailles contains different terms because the balance of military power shifted along a different axis. The point is that removing aviation from World War I doesn't just change how battles are fought. It changes which side has advantages, how long campaigns last, and ultimately how the war concludes and what peace looks like. But the impact extends far beyond military history. Consider commercial aviation, an industry that literally didn't exist before the airplane and now moves billions of passengers and millions of tons of cargo every year. In our world, the first commercial flights began in the 1910s, barely a decade after the Wright brothers and Santos Dumont proved that powered flight was possible. By the 1920s, airmail service connected cities across continents. By the 1930s, passenger airlines offered regular transcontinental and transoceanic service. By the 1950s, the jet age had begun, shrinking the world to a size unimaginable to previous generations. But in our alternate timeline, this entire industry emerges 2 decades later, if it emerges at all in the same form. The 1920s look like our 1900s in terms of transportation technology. The 1940s resemble our 1920s. The modern era, with its assumption of easy global mobility, doesn't arrive until perhaps the 1970s or 1980s. What does this mean practically? It means that international business operates at a fundamentally different pace. It means that global cultural exchange happens more slowly. It means that immigration patterns follow different trajectories because crossing an ocean remains a multi-week commitment rather than a several-hour flight. It means that entire industries that depend on rapid transportation of goods and people either don't exist or exist in radically diminished forms. Think about tourism. In our world, international tourism became a mass phenomenon in the second half of the 20th century, driven primarily by increasingly affordable air travel. Millions of people visit foreign countries every year, spending money, exchanging ideas, and building connections that shape global culture and politics. But without Santos Dumont's contributions to aviation, this industry remains boutique, limited to the wealthy who can afford slow ocean voyages or the determined who are willing to endure them. The cultural homogenization that comes with mass tourism doesn't happen, or happens much more slowly. Local cultures remain more isolated, more distinct, more purely themselves for better and worse. The world is larger, more mysterious, more difficult to traverse. What you lose in convenience, you might gain in diversity, but the trade-off affects everything from international relations to economic development to the spread of ideas and innovations. Now let's talk about something that might seem completely unrelated, but actually depends entirely on aviation technology, the space race. In our reality, the development of rockets and spacecraft drew heavily on aeronautical engineering, wind tunnel testing, understanding of high-altitude flight, and materials science developed for aircraft. The engineers who designed rockets were often the same people who designed planes, or at least worked in the same tradition and drew on the same body of knowledge. But in a world where aviation development is delayed by 2 decades, where the science and engineering of flight progresses more slowly, the space race also shifts in time. Maybe the first satellite launches in 1977 instead of 1957. Maybe the first human spaceflight happens in 1981 instead of 1961. Maybe we don't reach the moon until the 1990s, if at all. And this delay has profound implications for the Cold War, for technological development, for humanity's understanding of itself and its place in the cosmos. The space race was about more than just getting to space. It was a driver of innovation that produced technologies we use every day, from satellite communications to weather forecasting to GPS navigation. Delay or eliminate the space race, and you delay or eliminate all of those downstream innovations, creating a world that is technologically poorer and more limited in ways that are hard to fully comprehend. Let's bring this down to a more personal level. Think about your own life and how aviation touches it, often in ways you don't consciously recognize. Maybe you've flown to visit family in another state or country. Maybe you've taken a vacation to a distant destination. Maybe you've received packages shipped by air. Maybe you work in an industry that depends on air freight for components or supplies. Maybe you've eaten fresh fruit flown in from another hemisphere. Maybe you've benefited from medical supplies or organs transported by air. Maybe you simply enjoy the fact that you live in a connected world where distance is less tyrannical than it once was. Now remove all of that or delay it by decades and consider how different your life would be. Consider how different the world would be. Consider how many opportunities would be foreclosed, how many connections would never be made, how many innovations would never occur because the people who needed to meet never met, because the information that needed to flow never flowed at the necessary speed. But there's another dimension to this story that we need to explore, and it's more philosophical, more psychological. The airplane changed how humans think about themselves and their world. Before flight, we were earthbound creatures, limited by geography in fundamental ways. After flight, we became something different, something more expansive, something capable of transcending the limitations that bound all previous generations. The airplane didn't just change where we could go, it changed who we were. It changed our sense of possibility. It changed our dreams. And if Santos Dumont had never built his flying machines, if that transformation had been delayed or taken a different form, the psychological and cultural impact would be immeasurable. We would be different people, with different assumptions, different expectations, different visions of what humans can achieve. Maybe we'd be more humble, more accepting of limits. Maybe we'd be less ambitious, less driven to push boundaries. Or maybe we'd simply have channeled that drive in different directions, creating a world unrecognizable to us in other ways. There's also a specifically Brazilian dimension to this story that we shouldn't overlook. Santos Dumont was a national hero in Brazil, a symbol of Brazilian ingenuity and achievement. His success helped establish Brazil as a nation capable of contributing to global technological progress, not merely consuming innovations developed elsewhere. In our alternate timeline, where Santos Dumont never achieves his aviation breakthroughs, Brazil's national narrative changes. Maybe another Brazilian achieves greatness in another field, or maybe the nation's sense of itself develops along different lines. The point is that individual achievements, especially ones as significant as pioneering human flight, don't just change technology. They change national identity, cultural pride, and the stories people tell themselves about who they are and what they can accomplish. Let's consider the economic implications more carefully. The aviation industry, including aircraft manufacturing, airlines, airports, and all the supporting infrastructure and services, represents trillions of dollars in global economic activity and employs millions of people directly and indirectly. Remove or significantly delay this industry, and you remove a massive engine of economic growth and employment. But you don't just create a hole in the economy. You redirect resources and human talent elsewhere. Maybe shipbuilding becomes more advanced. Maybe rail networks are more extensive and sophisticated. Maybe we invest more heavily in other forms of transportation or communication technology. The economy doesn't shrink necessarily, but it looks completely different, with different winners and losers, different centers of prosperity, different patterns of development and trade. What about military strategy and geopolitics? In our world, air power fundamentally altered the balance between nations. A country's ability to project power beyond its borders depends heavily on aviation, both military and civilian. Air superiority can determine the outcome of conflicts. The threat of aerial bombardment shapes diplomatic negotiations. The ability to rapidly deploy forces by air affects alliance structures and security guarantees. In a world where aviation development is significantly delayed, global power structures might look very different. Maybe naval power remains dominant longer. Maybe the British Empire doesn't decline as quickly because control of the seas remains more important than control of the skies. Maybe different nations rise to prominence based on different strategic advantages. Maybe wars are fought differently, with different victors and different consequences, creating a geopolitical landscape we wouldn't recognize. There's a darker side to this story as well, one we should acknowledge. The airplane enabled unprecedented destruction. Aerial bombardment killed millions of civilians in World War II. The atomic bombs that ended that war were delivered by aircraft. The Cold War threat of nuclear annihilation depended on bombers and missiles that grew from aviation technology. If you delay aviation development, you potentially delay or alter these horrors. Maybe World War II is fought differently, with fewer civilian casualties from bombing. Maybe the nuclear age arrives later or takes a different form. Maybe the existential threat that shaped the latter half of the 20th century looks different in ways that are hard to predict. This is one area where the absence of Santos Dumont's contributions might actually create a better world, or at least a world with different, possibly less terrible, forms of destruction. Though it's worth noting that human ingenuity in finding ways to kill each other has never required any particular technology. We've always been creative in that regard, for better or worse. Now imagine the cultural productions that never exist in this alternate timeline. Think about all the movies about aviation, from Top Gun to Catch Me If You Can to Sully. Think about all the books, from The Little Prince to West with the Night, to countless thrillers and romances that depend on air travel. Think about all the music, from Come Fly With Me to Leaving on a Jet Plane. Think about how aviation has shaped our metaphors, our language, our artistic imagination. Remove or delay the airplane, and you remove or alter all of these cultural artifacts. Different stories get told, different metaphors emerge, different dreams capture the popular imagination. The cultural landscape of the 20th and 21st centuries looks completely different, and in ways that are probably impossible to fully predict, because culture is emergent and chaotic and dependent on countless small influences that build on each other in unpredictable ways. What about environmental impact? This is complicated. Aviation is a significant source of carbon emissions, contributing to climate change. In a world where aviation develops more slowly or differently, maybe we have lower emissions, maybe climate change is less severe, maybe we avoid some of the environmental catastrophe we're currently facing. But it's not that simple, because the transportation and economic activity that aviation enables would still happen, just in different forms that might have their own environmental costs. Maybe we burn more coal-moving goods by train. Maybe we use more fuel-moving people by ship. Maybe we simply develop in ways that are even more environmentally destructive because we don't have the global perspective and sense of planetary fragility that aviation helped create by literally allowing us to see the Earth from above. The environmental calculus is genuinely uncertain, with trade-offs that point in different directions. Let's talk about something more personal and immediate. How you, sitting wherever you are right now, watching this video, would be different in this alternate timeline. Maybe you wouldn't exist at all because your parents or grandparents never met, because one of them couldn't afford or wouldn't endure the sea voyage that would have been required without air travel. Maybe you'd be living in a different place because migration patterns were different. Maybe you'd have a different job because certain industries don't exist or exist in different forms. Maybe you'd have different friends, different experiences, different memories because the ease of global connection that aviation enables simply wasn't there. Maybe your worldview would be more parochial, more local, more limited to your immediate geographic area. Or maybe you'd be more deeply rooted, more connected to place, more embedded in local community, because the option to easily leave wasn't there. It's impossible to say with certainty, but it's absolutely clear that you would be different. Your life would be different in ways both large and small. Here's something to consider. Innovation is not inevitable. We often assume that technological progress follows a predetermined path, that someone would have invented the airplane even if Santos Dumont hadn't, that the course of development is fixed and immutable. But that's not how history works. Specific individuals matter, specific choices matter, specific moments of insight and courage and determination matter. If Santos Dumont had turned his attention elsewhere, if he had failed in his experiments, if he had died young or lost interest or simply been less brilliant and persistent, the entire trajectory of aviation development could have been radically different. Other pioneers might have eventually achieved similar results, but when and how and with what specific characteristics is not predetermined. The path of technological development depends on countless contingent factors, and removing one key figure can shift everything in ways that compound over time. What would our current world look like if this alternate timeline had actually occurred? We'd probably still have some form of aviation by now, in 2025, but it might be more limited, more expensive, less central to daily life. Maybe international air travel is still a luxury reserved for the wealthy. Maybe air freight is less common, making global supply chains less efficient. Maybe we have better train systems and more advanced ships to compensate. Maybe we invest more in telecommunications as a substitute for physical travel. Maybe virtual reality technology develops faster as a way to experience distant places without going there. Maybe. The specifics are impossible to determine with certainty, but the overall picture is clear. The world would be smaller in some ways, larger in others, more fragmented, less connected, more diverse, less homogeneous, and fundamentally different in ways that touch every aspect of human life. So what have we learned from this journey through an alternate history? We've learned that individual genius matters, that specific innovations at specific times can reshape civilization, that the world we take for granted is contingent on countless factors that could have been different. We've learned that aviation, which many of us barely think about as we book flights online or watch planes overhead, is actually foundational to modern life in ways that are invisible until you try to imagine the world without it. We've learned that Santos Dumont's contributions went far beyond building a few aircraft. He helped create the modern world with all its benefits and problems, all its connections and complications, all its opportunities and challenges. And we've learned that the butterfly effect is real, that small changes can have enormous consequences, that history is not predetermined, but rather emerges from countless individual choices and actions that build on each other in ways that are often unpredictable, but always significant. If Santos Dumont had never invented the airplane, or more accurately, if he had never demonstrated controlled powered flight and shared his innovations with the world, we would live in a radically different reality. Not necessarily better or worse in some absolute sense, but different in almost every way that matters. The pace of globalization would be slower. The trajectory of technological development would be altered. The outcomes of major historical events would be changed. The structure of the global economy would be unrecognizable. The nature of international relations would follow different patterns. And most importantly, we would be different people, with different experiences, different opportunities, different limitations, and different dreams. The world Santos Dumont helped create is the only world most of us have ever known, and it's worth taking a moment to appreciate just how much his vision, determination, and genius shaped the reality we inhabit today. As we come to the end of this documentary, I want you to think about the innovators in your own time, the people pushing boundaries and creating technologies that might seem experimental or impractical today, but could reshape the world tomorrow. Think about how individual choices and actions matter, how the course of history is not fixed, how we all play a role in creating the future, whether we realize it or not. And think about Santos Dumont himself, a man who looked at the sky and saw not a barrier but a possibility, who dedicated his life to making humanity's oldest dream a reality, and who succeeded in ways that changed everything. We owe him a debt that most people don't even realize exists, which is perhaps the greatest legacy of all. Innovations so successful that they become invisible, assumptions so deeply embedded that we forget they were once impossible dreams. Remember, we're trying to hit 100 comments on this video. Tell me what you think. Did this documentary change how you see aviation? Did it make you appreciate the world we live in differently? Do you think we'd be better off or worse off in that alternate timeline? And if you'd like, tell me where in the world you're watching this video from. Your comment is important, and I want to read and respond to it. For more exciting stories like this, click on the video that's playing on your screen right now.